Funeral Procession with K9 German Shepherd. Thank you for your service. A dog's loyalty never dies. But what happens when a military K9 has to say goodbye to its handler forever? Today, we bring you a heart-wrenching story of a K9 German Shepherd marching beside the coffin of its fallen soldier. A moment of honor, loss, and respect that no one present would ever forget. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. These emotional stories deserve to be shared and remembered. Get ready for a story of courage, sacrifice, and the purest form of canine loyalty. The military base was silent that gray morning. The wind cut across the training field as soldiers adjusted their uniforms, preparing for the hardest moment of all, saying goodbye to a brother in arms. Among them, lying beside the flag-draped coffin, was Max, AK-9 German Shepherd, who would serve alongside Sergeant James Carter for 5 years. He didn't understand the solemnity of the moment, but he felt the absence. Max had been trained for countless missions, explosive detection, combat rescues, dangerous night patrols, but nothing had prepared him for this. The scent of Carter was still present on the neatly folded uniform beside the coffin, but his handler was no longer there to call his name. The military base stood in solemn silence that morning. The sky was covered in heavy gray clouds, and the air was thick with the weight of unspoken grief. The usual sounds of barking dogs and marching boots had faded, replaced by the occasional sniffle of a soldier or the distant sound of the wind rustling through the trees. At the heart of the ceremony, draped in an American flag, was a coffin, the final resting place of Sergeant James Carter. Lying beside it, motionless except for the slow rise and fall of his chest, was Max, AK-9 German Shepherd who had been Carter's partner, his protector, and most importantly, his best friend for the past 5 years. Max was not just any military dog. He was a warrior trained for the battlefield, having completed multiple combat deployments. He had saved lives, detected explosives before they could take out entire squads, and stood fearless in the face of danger. But now, for the first time in his life, he was helpless. Max did not understand the meaning of the folded flag, the saluting soldiers, or the tears running down their hardened faces. But he understood one thing. Carter was not here. For the past 3 days, he had been waiting for his handler to call his name, waiting to hear that familiar voice giving him a command. But silence was all he received. A week ago, Carter and Max had been deployed on a mission overseas. Their task was to secure a route for incoming forces, scanning for explosives and enemy threats. Max had done his job, alerting Carter and the team to an IED buried beneath the sand. But before they could evacuate, an ambush erupted. Gunfire echoed through the air. Soldiers scattered for cover, and in the chaos, Carter was hit. Max stayed by his side, refusing to leave, even when Carter's blood soaked his fur. He had nudged his handler, whimpered, barked, anything to get him to wake up, but Carter had gone still, and no amount of training had prepared Max for that moment. Now at the funeral, as the ceremony began, Max raised his head. His dark eyes scanned the rows of soldiers standing at attention, their uniforms crisp, their expressions unreadable. Then the sound of the bugle playing taps filled the air. Max's ears perked up. He knew this sound. He had heard it before in ceremonies where fellow soldiers were honored after making the ultimate sacrifice. But today it was different. Today it was for his handler. As the first note rang out, Max let out a quiet whine. His tail, usually still and steady, trembled. Then, as if sensing the weight of the moment, he slowly stood up. A young Marine, kneeling beside him, whispered softly, "It's okay, boy. You're doing great." Max didn't look at him. His focus was on the coffin. Then the command came, K9 salute. It was Carter's commanding officer who spoke, his voice steady but thick with emotion. Max hesitated. Carter had always been the one to give him commands, but when the officer repeated it, the training took over. Max raised his paw, pressing it against the edge of the casket. A wave of silence washed over the crowd. Soldiers who had stood through countless funerals, who had buried brothers in arms and kept their emotions locked away, now found their throats tightening and their eyes burning. Max held the salute. His body was tense, his breathing controlled. And yet if anyone had looked closely, they would have seen the slight tremble in his leg. His eyes remained locked on the flag-draped coffin, as if waiting just one more time for Carter to reach out and take his paw in return. The salute was held until the last note of taps faded into the wind. Then, slowly, Max lowered his paw, stepped closer, and laid down against the coffin, resting his head on the wood. No one spoke, no one moved. In that moment, a warrior mourned his fallen soldier, not with words, but with the purest, most unwavering love. The weight of silence pressed heavily on the funeral procession. No one spoke as Max remained lying against the coffin, his body tense but unmoving. The soldiers standing in formation stole glances at the German shepherd, their hardened expressions momentarily cracking at the sight of such raw, unfiltered grief. Max had always been more than just a military canine. He had been Carter's shadow, his protector, his constant in a world of chaos. And now that world felt unbearably empty. The funeral detail proceeded with precision. The honor guard moved forward, lifting the flag off the coffin, folding it with deliberate care. Max's ears twitched at every motion. His sharp eyes followed each movement. The scent of his handler was still there, faint but present, embedded in the fabric of the uniform, in the wood of the coffin, in the earth beneath them. The folded flag was handed to Carter's mother. Her hands trembled as she took it, her face carved with pain. She had lost her son, and yet she was not the only one who had lost a family member. Max still refused to move. He lay there, his breathing slow, his mind unable to accept that his handler was truly gone. Then a voice broke the silence. Sergeant Max. The German shepherd's ears perked. The voice was deep, authoritative, but it was not Carter's. Standing before him was Captain Reynolds, Carter's superior officer, a man who had led them through countless missions. His sharp, weathered face was unreadable, but his voice carried something more than just command. It carried understanding. "Come here, soldier." Max hesitated. Carter had always been the one to call him, but when Reynolds gave the command again, training and instinct took over. Slowly, almost reluctantly, Max rose to his feet, his muscles aching from the tension, his paws feeling heavy as he stepped away from the coffin. As he approached, Captain Reynolds knelt down to meet his gaze. He would have wanted you to be strong. His voice was low, steady. You were his partner, Max, and you did your duty. Max blinked his amber eyes. He was listening, but he wasn't sure he understood. Then something unexpected happened. Carter's mother, still clutching the folded flag, dropped to her knees and opened her arms. "Come here, sweetheart," she whispered. Max hesitated again. She smelled like Carter. There was something in her voice, something soft, familiar, and then, without fully understanding why, he took slow steps toward her, lowering his head as she wrapped her arms around him. Tears streamed down her face as she held onto the dog that had protected her son. "Thank you," she murmured into his fur. "Thank you for taking care of him." Max let out a soft whine, pressing his nose into her shoulder. He had not been trained for this. Grief, loss, or the emptiness left behind. But something about the way she held him, the way her fingers ran through his coat, made him feel less alone. The soldier stood in silence, watching the quiet exchange between the fallen soldier's mother and his K9. Some of them had seen this kind of loyalty before, but few had ever felt it so deeply. After a long moment, Captain Reynolds cleared his throat. It was time. "Max," he said firmly. The German shepherd lifted his head. His ears twitched at the authority in Reynolds' voice. "The unit is leaving tomorrow. You'll be coming with me." The words settled heavily in the air. Max was still enlisted, a soldier without his handler. Carter's mother looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "What will happen to him?" she asked softly. Reynolds hesitated. "Max is one of the best. He can still serve." She nodded slowly, but there was a sadness in her eyes that wasn't just grief. It was something else, something more personal. She looked at Max, then back at the captain. "I just don't want him to be alone." Reynolds exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. He had seen it before. K9s struggling after losing their handlers. Some adapted, some didn't. Max was strong, but strength didn't always mean resilience. "We'll take care of him," Reynolds promised. But as the last echoes of the ceremony faded and the soldiers began to disperse, one thing was clear. Max was still searching, still waiting, because deep down, he wasn't ready to leave his handler behind. The base felt different without him. Max walked beside Captain Reynolds, his steps slow, his ears pinned back. The scent of Carter still lingered faintly in the air, clinging to the walls, to the ground, to every inch of the space they had shared. But no matter how much Max searched for it, it was fading. Everything was fading. Since the funeral, Max had remained quiet, withdrawn. The usual commands barely registered. He ate when told, walked when needed. But something inside him was missing. For years, Carter had been his world. Every day, every mission, every breath had been spent by his handler's side. But now there were no commands, no voice calling his name, no steady hand resting on his back. The other handlers in the unit watched him with quiet sympathy. They had seen it before. Dogs lost without their partners, waiting at doors that would never open, searching for voices they would never hear again. Some K9s recovered, others didn't. No one knew which category Max would fall into. When Reynolds led him past the kennels, Max hesitated. This was supposed to be home, but it wasn't anymore. Carter's scent was gone from the training yard, from the sleeping quarters. Every familiar place felt empty, hollow. His ears twitched as soldiers murmured his name in passing, some kneeling to scratch behind his ears or whisper a quiet good boy, but their voices weren't the one he wanted to hear. Without waiting for a command, Max turned away from the kennels and began walking toward Carter's quarters. Reynolds followed silently, his boots crunching softly against the gravel. He had expected this. He had seen Max hesitate at every turn, waiting for something, waiting for Carter. And now, he knew exactly where the dog was heading. When they reached the door, Max sat down. He stared at it, unmoving, as if expected to open at any moment. The room was empty now. The bed neatly made, Carter's belongings packed away. But Max didn't know that. He only knew that this was where his handler was supposed to be. Reynolds exhaled, crossing his arms as he watched. Minutes passed, then an hour. Max didn't move. Soldiers walked by, some pausing to glance at him, their expressions heavy with understanding. "He's waiting," one of them muttered. Reynolds nodded. "Yeah, he is." The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the base. Max's tail twitched slightly, his ears shifting with every faint sound. But his eyes never left the door. He was waiting for Carter, waiting for the voice that had guided him through war zones, that had comforted him after long missions, that had been the one constant in his world. But no command would come. No door would open. As the evening stretched into night, Reynolds finally moved. He crouched beside Max, resting a hand gently on the dog's back. Max didn't flinch. He didn't react. But he felt the warmth of the touch. "He's not coming back, buddy," Reynolds said quietly, his voice rough, thick with something he wasn't used to showing. "I know it hurts. I know you don't understand why." Max blinked slowly, his breathing steady. But deep down, he understood enough. The emptiness, the stillness. He knew Carter was gone, but knowing didn't make it easier. Reynolds sighed, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. He had seen men grieve in different ways. Some turned to silence, others to rage. But the sight of Max sitting so patiently in front of that door broke something in him in a way no battlefield ever had. "You have to move forward," Reynolds murmured, moored himself into the dog. Max finally turned his head just slightly, acknowledging the man beside him. There was no wag of his tail, no spark in his eyes. But maybe, just maybe, there was understanding. Reynolds gave him one last pat before standing. "Come on, soldier." For a long moment, Max didn't move. Then, with a slow, reluctant motion, he rose to his feet. His body was tense, his movement stiff, but he followed Reynolds away from the door, away from the past. But as they walked into the night, one thing remained unchanged. Max would always be searching. Even if he knew, deep down, that the one he was looking for would never return. The days that followed were eerily quiet. Max continued his routine, but it was different now. He followed commands, but his movements were slow, mechanical. He ate when food was placed in front of him, but without the same eagerness. He trained when ordered, but there was no spark in his eyes. It was as if part of him had shut down. Captain Reynolds watched him closely, concerned but not surprised. The bond between a handler and his K9 wasn't just about orders or discipline. It was built on trust, on connection, on an unspoken understanding that they would always have each other's back. Carter had been Max's entire world, and now that world had been shattered. One afternoon, Reynolds decided it was time to test something. He took Max to the training field, where the other K9 units were running drills. The German shepherds barked, jumped over obstacles, and responded to commands with precision. Their handlers moved beside them, calling out instructions, rewarding them with praise and treats. Max watched but didn't react. His ears twitched at the familiar sounds, his body tense, but he stayed still. Reynolds knelt beside him. "Come on, buddy, let's try something." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a well-worn ball. Carter's ball. It was scuffed and chewed at the edges, the same one Carter had always carried during downtime. He would toss it absent-mindedly while talking with the other soldiers, sometimes rolling it toward Max just to see how long he could ignore it before pouncing. Reynolds held it up. "Go get it, Max." He tossed it across the field. Max didn't move. Reynolds tried again, his voice firmer. "Fetch, Max." Max's tail twitched. His ears perked slightly, but his paws remained planted on the ground. One of the other handlers, a younger soldier named Ortiz, approached. He crouched down, looking Max in the eyes. "He doesn't want the ball," Ortiz murmured. "He wants Carter." Reynolds exhaled, tossing the ball aside. "Yeah, I know." The silence stretched between them as the other dogs barked and ran through their drills, oblivious to the weight of the moment. Then a voice called from across the field. "Captain Reynolds." A female officer jogged toward them, a clipboard in hand. "We need to talk," she said. Her gaze flickered to Max before settling on Reynolds. "It's about his reassignment." Reynolds stiffened. "Reassignment?" She nodded. "Max is one of our best. The unit needs him." She glanced down at the German shepherd, who still hadn't moved. "Heck, not himself. You know that as well as I do." Reynolds clenched his jaw. "So what's the alternative?" Collins hesitated before answering. "Retirement." The word hit harder than Reynolds expected. K9S served until they couldn't anymore, but Max wasn't old, wasn't injured. He still had years left in him, if his heart was in it. Reynolds looked at Max, who was still staring toward the training field, eyes distant. Carter's mother's voice echoed in his mind. "I just don't want him to be alone." "Who would take him?" Reynolds asked, his voice quieter now. Collins checked her clipboard. "We have options. A few handlers have expressed interest in adopting retired K9S. There's also a program that places them with veterans." But she hesitated. Carter's mother put in a request. Reynolds' breath caught. "She did." Collins nodded. She wanted to take him home. The idea made sense. Carter had talked about his mother often, about the home he had grown up in, the open fields where he used to run as a kid. If anyone could give Max the peace he needed, maybe it was her. But would Max accept that? Collins sighed. "It's your call, Captain, but I'll be honest. If he stays here, I don't think he'll ever be the same. He needs a fresh start." Reynolds looked at Max again. The dog was still, but something in his posture had changed. His tail twitched slightly. His ears shifted back toward them, as if listening for the first time in weeks. A decision had to be made. The decision weighed heavily on Captain Reynolds. Max was one of the best military K9s they had, strong, disciplined, fearless. But the spark that made him a warrior, the drive that pushed him to protect and serve, had dimmed. He wasn't the same dog. Reynolds watched as Max sat silently, his eyes still fixed on the field where the other dogs trained. The sound of barking, the sharp calls of commands, the clinking of metal collars. These were once the sound that fueled his purpose. But now, they only seemed like echoes of a life he no longer understood. Sergeant Collins cleared her throat, breaking the heavy silence. "Carter's mother is willing to take him, but it has to be your call. If you think he can still serve, we'll keep him in the program." Reynolds exhaled. He had seen plenty of war dogs retire, most of them due to old age or injury, but this was different. Max's wounds weren't visible. They were inside, deep in places no medic could reach. He crouched beside the German shepherd, rubbing his fingers through the thick fur at the base of his neck. "What do you think, buddy?" he murmured. Max blinked but didn't move. Reynolds knew the answer before he even asked. The next morning, everything was arranged. Carter's mother, Evelyn, would be coming to base to take Max home. The paperwork was signed, and the process moved faster than expected. It felt surreal. One moment, Max had been a soldier, part of an elite unit, and now he was leaving. On the day of the transfer, Reynolds stood outside the barracks, watching as a black SUV pulled up. Evelyn stepped out, dressed in simple jeans and a jacket. Her eyes were weary but kind. She had aged in the weeks since Carter's passing. Grief had a way of doing that. Max stood beside Reynolds, ears perked but body tense. His tail was still, his stance uncertain. Evelyn approached slowly, kneeling down a few feet away from Max. She didn't reach out, didn't call for him. Instead, she simply looked at him with tired eyes and said, "Hi, sweetheart." Max's ears twitched. His nose lifted slightly as he took in her scent. Familiar, but different. A scent of home, of Carter, of something safe. He hesitated. Reynolds felt the tension in the air. He didn't know if Max would move, if he would accept this new reality, if he would ever find peace away from the battlefield. Then slowly, Max took a step forward. Evelyn remained still, waiting. Another step. Then before anyone could react, Max closed the distance between them and pressed his head against her chest. Evelyn let out a quiet sob as she wrapped her arms around him, holding him the way she had once held her son. "Oh, baby, I know," she whispered. "I miss him too." Reynolds looked away, swallowing hard. For the first time since Carter's death, Max had made a choice of his own. It wasn't an order, it wasn't training. It was love. Evelyn wiped her tears, running her fingers through Max's fur. She looked up at Reynolds. "Thank you for everything." Reynolds nodded. "Take care of him." She smiled softly, still holding Max close. "He'll be home now." As she led him to the SUV, the German shepherd paused once to look back at Reynolds. Their eyes met. One final silent exchange, one last acknowledgement between soldiers. Then, without hesitation, Max jumped into the car. As the vehicle pulled away, Reynolds exhaled. Max wasn't just retiring. He was finally going home. The drive home was quiet. Max lay in the back seat, his head resting on Evelyn's lap as she absent-mindedly stroked his fur. The gentle hum of the road beneath them was calming, but he remained alert, his ears twitching at every sound, every passing curve, every unfamiliar noise. Evelyn glanced down at him, offering a soft smile. "You can rest now, sweetheart," she murmured. "You're safe." Max didn't close his eyes. He had spent years trained to always be aware, to always be ready. Relaxing wasn't something that came easily anymore. When they finally arrived at the house, Evelyn opened the door and stepped out, waiting for Max to follow. He hesitated at first, scanning the surroundings. There were no uniforms here, no barking commands, no scent of gunpowder or sweat. Just fresh air, the rustling of trees, and the faint smell of something home-cooked drifting from the open window. With cautious steps, he followed her up the porch and into the house. The moment he stepped inside, the scent hit him. It was faint, but it was there. Carter, his handler, had once lived here. His scent lingered in the walls, in the furniture, in the very essence of the home. Max's ears perked, and his tail gave the smallest twitch. Evelyn watched him carefully, her heart aching. As she saw the recognition in his eyes, she knelt down beside him. "He grew up here, you know," she said softly. This was his room. She pushed open a door, revealing a bedroom frozen in time. The neatly made bed, the shelves lined with books and photographs, the old military posters on the wall. It was all still there. Carter's scent was strongest here. And for the first time since he left the base, Max took a deep breath. Evelyn smiled through the sadness. "It's okay, baby. You can go in." Max stepped forward hesitantly, his paws silent on the hardwood floor. He sniffed the air, moving toward the bed where Carter had once slept. Slowly, he climbed onto it, circling once before lying down. His head rested on the pillow where the scent of his handler was strong enough. A soft sigh escaped him. For the first time in weeks, Max felt something close to peace. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed, watching him. "You miss him, don't you?" she whispered. Max's ears twitched, but he remained still. "I do, too." Her voice trembled slightly. "But I think he would want you to be happy here." She reached out, running a gentle hand over his head. For the first time since Carter's death, Max didn't pull away. That night, Max didn't move from the bed. He stayed curled up in the same spot, his breast deep and steady. Outside, the crickets chirped and the moon cast a soft glow through the window. For the first time in what felt like forever, Max slept. And for the first time, he didn't wake up searching for orders that would never come. The drive home was quiet. Max lay in the back seat, his head resting on Evelyn's lap as she absent-mindedly stroked his fur. The gentle hum of the road beneath them was calming, but he remained alert, his ears twitching at every sound, every passing car, every unfamiliar noise. Evelyn glanced down at him, offering a soft smile. "You can rest now, sweetheart," she murmured. "You're safe." Max didn't close his eyes. He had spent years trained to always be aware, to always be ready. Relaxing wasn't something that came easily anymore. When they finally arrived at the house, Evelyn opened the door and stepped out, waiting for Max to follow. He hesitated at first, scanning the surroundings. There were no uniforms here, no barking commands, no scent of gunpowder or sweat. Just fresh air, the rustling of trees, and the faint smell of something home-cooked drifting from the open window. With cautious steps, he followed her up the porch and into the house. The moment he stepped inside, the scent hit him. It was faint, but it was there. Carter, his handler, had once lived here, and his scent lingered in the walls, in the furniture, in the very essence of the home. Max's ears perked, and his tail gave the smallest twitch. Evelyn watched him carefully, her heart aching as she saw the recognition in his eyes. She knelt down beside him. "He grew up here, you know," she said softly. This was his room. She pushed open a door, revealing a bedroom frozen in time. The neatly made bed, the shelves lined with books and photographs, the old military posters on the wall. It was all still there. Carter's scent was strongest here, and for the first time since he had left the base, Max took a deep breath. Evelyn smiled through the sadness. "It's okay, baby. You can go in." Max stepped forward hesitantly, his paws silent on the hardwood floor. He sniffed the air, moving toward the bed where Carter had once slept. Slowly, he climbed onto it, circling once before lying down. His head rested on the pillow where the scent of his handler was strongest. A soft sigh escaped him. For the first time in weeks, Max felt something close to peace. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed, watching him. "You miss him, don't you?" she whispered. Max's ears twitched, but he remained still. "I do, too." Her voice trembled slightly. "But I think he would want you to be happy here." She reached out, running a gentle hand over his head. For the first time since Carter's death, Max didn't pull away. That night, Max didn't move from the bed. He stayed curled up in the same spot, his breast deep and steady. Outside, the crickets chirped and the moon cast a soft glow through the window. For the first time in what felt like forever, Max slept. And for the first time, he didn't wake up searching for orders that would never come. The following days were slow but different. Max followed Evelyn around the house, not out of duty, but out of something else, comfort. The once vigilant K-9 began to settle, his sharp focus easing as the weight of war started to fade. One afternoon, Evelyn sat on the porch staring at the horizon. Max lay beside her, his head resting on her lap. "You know," she murmured, stroking his fur, "Carter always said you were more than just a soldier. You were family." Max didn't move, but his tail gave a slow, gentle wag. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't just surviving. He was living. Months passed, and Max transformed. The rigid tension in his body eased. The nightmares that once made him stir in his sleep became less frequent. He still sat by the front door sometimes, ears twitching at distant sounds, but not out of duty, just out of habit. One evening, as Evelyn sat by the fireplace, She looked over at Max curled up at her feet. "You were never meant to be alone," she whispered. Max blinked his amber eyes, warm. He stretched, let out a quiet sigh, then rested his head on her feet. He wasn't alone, not anymore. One morning, as Evelyn tended to flowers in the backyard, she felt something brush against her side. She turned to see Max, his tail wagging slightly, a ball in his mouth. Her breath caught. It was Carter's ball. She knelt, her hands trembling, as she took it from his jaws. "You want to play?" she whispered. Max let out a soft huff. With a teary smile, she threw the ball across the yard. Max took off, not as a soldier, not as a K-9, but as a toy running freely under the morning sun. For the first time in a long time, Max wasn't chasing orders. He was chasing happiness.